From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading and literacy promotion arm of the library. And we were created several decades ago by Daniel Borston when he was Librarian of Congress, who felt there should be a way for the Library of Congress to use its resources and its prestige to reach out to promote books and reading. And those were the days when literacy wasn't quite the hot topic that it has since become. So our mission really has been expanded slightly to stimulate public interest in books, reading, literacy, and libraries, which have to be part of America's book culture, but also to encourage the historical study of these same topics. And the Center for the Book does that not only through public programming, such as this Books and Beyond series, but also nationally through networks of affiliated state centers for the book in each state, which often promote local writers, state writers, and have events such as statewide author awards and or state or regional book festivals. And the regional book festivals are in part patterned after the Library of Congress National Book Festival, which was created in 2001 and in which the Center for the Book plays a major role. We also work on this particular series and a variety of other public events, including the new Library of Congress Literacy Awards, which are an effort on the part of a benefactor, David Rubenstein, in the Washington area, to urge the Library of Congress to do more in recognizing the literacy problem and organizations that are trying to do something about it. So that is a large part of our effort. We also include the Young Readers Center for the Library of Congress, which is open to young people 16 and under, and more recently we've become the administrator of the Poetry and Literature program. So you can see that we have a full platter, but they're all wonderful book and reading related topics. So we're a hard-working group, but we have lots of opportunities to meet people and to promote not only books and reading, but also the Library of Congress. Today we are continuing our Books and Beyond series, which the Center created in at least 20 years ago. These are talks about new books that have been published that have some relationship to the Library of Congress. And often it's that the author has used the library's collections, and such is the case today, among other attributes of the book. And in this case, we're pleased that the Manuscript Division is our co-sponsor. In other instances, the books that we sponsor in this series are the result of a special project at the Library of Congress or a special program that relates to the Library of Congress's reaching out and our long-term interest in books and reading. The program itself will consist of a talk by our author, who will be introduced in a moment, and also a discussion period, a Q&A period, we hope, immediately following the presentation. And I should say that all of our programs are filmed for future reference on the Library of Congress website. So if you would be kind enough to turn off all things electronic and to realize that asking a question in the Q&A session is tantamount to, in other words, it really is giving your permission for your image and words to perhaps be used as part of our website. Part of every Books and Beyond program is a book signing, and we need to start the book signing no later than 1 o'clock. So I will stop and introduce Julie Miller, who is the early American specialist in the Manuscript Division, who will introduce our speaker, but I want to give Julie a plug. She has been here since 2009, and one of her first book was also a subject of a Books and Beyond presentation. Shortly after her start, she started here. So she's a veteran of the program, and I'm pleased to have her here to introduce our speaker. Let's give Julie a hand.
Thanks, John. Today, I'm happy to welcome Cassandra Good to the Library of Congress to discuss her new book, which you can see over here, Founding Friendships Between Men and Women in the Early American Republic, which has just been published by Oxford University Press. Cassandra is the associate editor of the papers of James Monroe at the University of Mary Washington. She received her doctorate in history from the University of Pennsylvania in 2012. Her field, correct me if I'm wrong, is gender and cultural history. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. In 18th and 19th century America. She's taught history at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Mary Washington, and George Washington University. She's also had curatorial and consulting positions at several museums, including the Smithsonian here in Washington. She has published articles and delivered conference papers on James Monroe, the family of George Washington, and friendship in early America. This is her first book. Cassandra is a frequent visitor to the Manuscript Division reading room, where she did some of the research for this book. The Manuscript Division collects papers that document the history and culture of the United States from the colonial period to the present. We have the papers of George Washington and Groucho Marx, Benjamin Franklin and Johnny Carson, just imagine them in the same room, Susan B. Anthony and Robert Bork. I had fun coming up with this, as you can tell. The NAACP and the Book of the Month Club, Alexander Hamilton, Alexander Graham Bell, and Alexander Haig, and a lot more also, of course. Cassandra is one of the many scholars, students, and members of the public who every day in our reading room use these raw materials to create new works, such as this book. Cassandra's book, and she may also want to correct me about this, perhaps, is a history of the emotions. Would you characterize it that way? In part, okay. You might think that something as intuitive as the emotions would have no history, but everyone who reads the letters of 18th and 19th century people sees right away that their emotional landscape was significantly different from ours, to the point where we can hardly understand what they're saying sometimes. How do you explain, and this is something Cassandra talks about in her book, how do you explain, for example, the language that people use to close their letters? Listen to Thomas Jefferson ending a letter to Alexander Hamilton's sister-in-law. You might ask, why was he writing to Alexander Hamilton's sister-in-law? His friend, Angelica Skyler Church. This is what he wrote. I cherish with fondness those affectionate sentiments of esteem and respect with which I am, dear madam, your sincere friend and humble servant. Think of that the next time you get a text from a teenager. But what exactly did he mean? This would have been clear to him. It's partly formulaic, and it's partly not. It's the job of cultural historians to make sense of language like this so that we can understand what people in the past were saying. That is what Cassandra Good is here to do today with this fascinating book. Welcome.
Thank you to Julie and to the Center for the Book for having me today. It's a real pleasure to speak here since I did so much of the research for this book here, and since I'm here all the time doing research for my work at the James Monroe papers. So I'm going to talk to you today about how I came to write this book, and then walk you through some of the big themes and questions, and then suggest what the larger implications of this might be, both for how we understand the past and how we understand today. And I will be addressing some of this issue that Julie brought up of openings and closings of letters. And I'll have some images to go along with this. So the idea for this book actually came up over 10 years ago when I was an undergraduate reading the letters of Margaret Bayard Smith, a Washington society woman who you see on the left here. And in 1809, she was writing to her sister about having to say goodbye to Thomas Jefferson as he was leaving Washington, going back to Monticello in 1809. He'd just finished his second term as president, and Madison was coming in. And going to Monticello meant he was going not just, for us, a 2.5-hour drive away, but a really long way away, and she might not see him again. And she wrote her sister, "My eyes are so blinded with tears that I can scarcely trace these lines." And then she wrote about the experience of seeing Jefferson at Madison's inauguration event, the last time that she would see him for a long time. And she said, "When I saw our dear and venerable Mr. Jefferson, my heart beat. When he saw me, he advanced from the crowd, took my hand affectionately, and held it 5 or 6 minutes." And when I read this at age 20 or 21, I thought, I have discovered an affair. And Thomas Jefferson was having an affair. Now, this was actually a published letter, although the original is at the Library of Congress. And I came to realize, in fact, that this is how people talked about friendship in the 18th and 19th centuries. They spoke in much warmer terms, even in friendships between men and women. And given that in my own life I had seen in popular culture and things like When Harry Met Sally, this idea that men and women couldn't be friends or that it led to all sorts of complications, I wondered, how is this really possible for people to do in early America when things were much more restricted in terms of women's roles and sexuality, and just how society worked was so different. So to start off with, just to define what I mean by friendship here, for my purposes in the book, I'm talking about an affectionate, reciprocal relationship between two people who are not related to each other or married that cast a relationship in terms of a friendship. And this is also a relationship where, because they're not related to each other or married, people have the choice of who to be friends with or to stop being friends with, the freedom to enter or leave a relationship. And these are mostly elite and middling class people that I'm talking about, partially because of the sort of sources I was using here. And so my starting assumption here is that these friendships are indeed possible. I do not call them platonic friendships because the word platonic in this period in early America actually meant romantic but not consummated. So the word comes up occasionally in friendships between men and women, but it's not really a good fit for what these friendships were about. And I argue that friendships could be just as central to people's lives in this period as romantic love. So I open the book actually with another story from Margaret Bayard Smith about her friend Anthony Bleeker, who you see here. So I want to share this with you. Friendship, not romance, came to mind when Margaret Bayard Smith crafted a scene between two lovers on the banks of Potomac River for her 1824 novel Winter in Washington. The lovers, Louisa and Sidney, listened to the sounds of the water, gazed at the view, and talked at leisure. For the 45-year-old Smith, the story of the young lovers brought to mind another pair, her younger self and her friend Anthony Bleeker, walking along the Raritan Bay in New Jersey. Quote, "I was as happy walking with my friend on the shores of the Raritan as Louisa was with her lover," she told Bleeker when she sent him the manuscript. Smith challenged the idea that romantic love was the supreme human pleasure, asking, "Has not friendship recollections as sweet and dear as those of love?" Her answer, "Yes, indeed it has, at least in my heart." So from this starting point of taking these relationships seriously and understanding that these were really important relationships that were just worded in different ways than we might expect, I structured the book around a series of questions about how these relationships actually worked. So starting off, what did people gain from these relationships? And as we can see from the Margaret Bayard Smith example, there's real emotional connection and often emotional support involved. If there was an age difference in particular, you might see a sort of mentoring relationship where one person gave the other advice, some sort of mutual improvement through their correspondence. They believed they were making each other more virtuous and better people. They offered each other intellectual stimulation. They might also, and this usually occurred among people the same age, help each other out in courtship. So I want to give you another example, and pretty much all the examples I'm giving today are from collections here in the manuscript room. So this is from the John Rogers papers. He is best known for serving in the Barbary Wars and then the War of 1812. He was a naval hero. And he came from Haverstraw, Maryland, and grew up with a woman named Anne Pinckney, who was a good friend of his. And he first met a woman named Minerva Dennison in 1802 at a dinner party and fell in love at first sight. She initially rejected him, saying she was too young to be married. But he held out hope even as he returned to sea to fight pirates in Tripoli. So in 1803, he wrote his friend Anne that, quote, "Through all the storms of English, Italian, and Spanish beauty, which have alternatively threatened to wreck my constancy, my heart has ever and without variation played me the tune of Minerva." And he apologized for writing to Anne just to ask about Minerva, but advised her to, quote, "Put only the right construction on my motives, and I'm sure you will without hesitation pardon me." Anne responded by saying there was really very little she could tell him. Quote, "I have seen your goddess but once since you left this country, and I am not her confidant, so I cannot expect to make a discovery of her heart to me." She's saying, I might be friends with you, but I'm not friends with her yet. I can't tell you whether she's in love with you. So when Rogers came back to the United States in December 1803, he resumed his courtship with Minerva. And on January 11th, 1804, Anne stayed up late into the cold winter night to report encouraging news about Minerva. After Rogers' most recent visit to her, Minerva had revealed her true feelings for him to Anne. She admitted that she had liked Rogers from their very first meeting, but was worried he was going to sea and might never come back. Now that he was home safely, however, she, quote, "with all honesty and candor, confessed her love and glories in her choice." And for her part, Anne concluded that she had said enough in her letter to, quote, "sate a man in love." And in fact, John Rogers and Minerva Dennison were engaged within 2 months of this letter. So Anne really helped facilitate this for somebody who it's a little bit hard to be courting a woman when you are off fighting pirates. I think another factor here that people gained from these relationships, especially in a time when people lost family members quite often or might be living apart from their family, was having sort of surrogate family members, friends that could act as a sister, brother, even mother or father. And another example here to give of a relationship between two people that had a lot of these qualities that I've been talking about, a lot of these benefits, was that between Thomas Jefferson and Abigail Adams, and that's who you see on the cover of the book. This is a letter from Abigail Adams to Thomas Jefferson that is in the Jefferson Papers here and is actually available online. And you can see her handwriting is a little bit difficult to read here, but they exchanged letters for many years. They met each other in Paris in the 1780s. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were already friends, and as soon as Abigail met Thomas Jefferson, they really connected. They matched wits. They went to concerts and plays together, and they also exchanged political information and advice. When the Adams left Paris and went to London, Abigail would also write to Jefferson and ask him to pick up shopping items that she couldn't get in London, sort of luxury items only available in Paris. And when you read these letters, you can see just the connection between these two people, and also these are just really fun letters to read. There's a playfulness about them, and I see that in a lot of these letters between male-female friends. What, though, was this line between romance and friendship? If you watched the John Adams miniseries several years ago on HBO, it sort of hinted there might be something going on between Jefferson and Abigail Adams. How do we know what is really going on here? And this is especially tricky. Here I'm showing you an image of, it's a little bit hard to see because it's a sketch, but this is Ben Franklin in London with a woman on his lap embracing him. There's, first of all, the fact that in my definition, I did not talk about physical intimacy or sex, and that's partially because I don't think that definition of friendship excludes those things. It was possible to have a flirtation or a friendship with benefits, as we might call it today, in these relationships in the past. Also, there's the fact that an attraction between two people did not negate a friendship. And then there's just the factor that as historians, we don't always know exactly what happened. People did not generally write about the most intimate physical and sexual experiences in the past. We have some exceptions to that, but usually they didn't. And there was a big risk involved. So I think that in a lot of cases, the best we can do is look at the language of the time, understand how emotions worked in different types of relationships, and understand, too, that people at the time were sometimes confused about the status of a relationship. They would write in diaries or letters trying to figure out whether this was a romantic relationship or not. And part of their trouble in even writing about this is that there was no category or term in the language to express their feelings for a friend of the opposite sex, or even, we might use the term platonic friendship. As I explained before, they didn't even have a term for these relationships. So that certainly made it more difficult to figure out the status of a friendship. I then moved to looking at how society viewed these friendships, and that sort of provides the context for how people understood their own relationships. And the answer in general is they were viewed pretty negatively. These friendships were seen as having one of two inevitable paths. They either led to seduction, and there were a lot of seduction novels in this period. A woman would get pregnant out of wedlock after being seduced by a man and die, or the pair fell in love and they got married. In either case, you don't have a friendship that persists. So I want to read you a couple of quotes from advice books at the time. So the idea was that a man would seduce a woman by using the term friend, by pretending to be her friend. So here's an advice book from a man named Father Gregory writing to his niece. Beware then, Susanna, of friendship from a man. He might, quote, assume the mask of friendship in order to seduce her. And to convince her that these risks were real, he offered an example of an acquaintance who had given him advice on dealing with a young woman. Quote, if she is not to be gained by the common modes, make a pretension of being her friend. So we saw this as an example of friendship being, quote, prostituted to screen the most infamous purposes. So there is this real fear here. And then a more playful version of this in another sort of didactic novel from the period, the author says, in friendship with the other sex, be cautious, they are apt to vex. And it was not just a vexation of being tricked, there was risk of real loss of reputation, which meant a woman's ability to get married, and even a risk of being ostracized, or, as these novels would tell it, of dying. So there weren't really models in conduct books, etiquette books, novels of how these friendships should work. So people had to sort of figure out on their own strategies to make the relationships appear safe and proper. They did this in a number of ways. So one of those ways is just embedding that relationship in a larger group or including a third party. So they might call that person brother or sister, sort of bringing them into their family circle. They might include that friendship as part of their religious community, where God actually becomes the third party to the relationship, because the idea, especially among some evangelicals in this period, as well as among Quakers, was that a friendship could be a meeting of souls that would get you closer to God, and God sort of became that safe third party in the relationship. And then, of course, if somebody was married, they would include the spouse in that relationship. So we saw with Jefferson and John and Abigail Adams, Jefferson often wrote letters to both of them on the same day or addressed a letter to them jointly. He was including both of them, and that's usually what happens. Marriage really changes the stakes for a woman for her involvement in a friendship. And I want to give you one example from Sir Augustus John Foster, who was minister to the United States from Britain in the early 19th century. And there's a large collection of his letters here at the Library of Congress, as well as some diaries he kept. And in 1805, he wrote this letter to his mother about a young woman he had grown up with, who he'd just written a letter to and didn't realize she'd gotten married. My dearest Ma, I cannot fancy Lady Caroline married. I cannot be glad of it. How changed she must be. I had just finished a letter to her. I cannot tear it, and so pray do not betray my secret, and let it pass as if I knew nothing in this remote country of her marriage. As it is not a love letter, it may go, and if I don't answer so, I never can to her now. She is under laws of a man. It is the first death of a woman. They must die twice, for I am sure all their friends, their male ones at least, receive a pang when they change characters so completely. So when a woman married, she pretty much became a legal possession of her husband. This was sort of a legal fiction called coverture, where the husband had the wife as a piece of property, and before the law, that's often how she was treated. And if a male friend wanted to write to her, he often needed to get permission from the husband, or at least have spoken to the husband about it, or include him in the letter in some way. So it's not just a strategy to make these relationships appear safe by including a spouse. It was really a necessity. Another area where we can see the way these strategies work, or really the main area, is with letters. And I'm showing you closings to a few different letters. Here's another letter from Jefferson to Angelica Skyler Church from UVA. And then at the bottom, a letter from the collection here from George Washington to Annis Boudinot Stockton, who I'll mention a bit later. There were sort of formulaic ways that you opened or closed a letter. And if you were writing, I was able to look at people's courtship letters or letters to a spouse, letters to a business partner, and then letters to their friends to sort of see how this was different. If you were writing to somebody that was a romantic partner, you would often use their first name. Or we know the example with Abigail Adams, she would say, my dearest friend, when she wrote John Adams. Friend was a word used to address spouses. Occasionally friends used my dear friend, not dearest, but often they just started out with dear sir or dear madam. And then when they signed the letter, in a romantic letter, you'd see mentions about heart or love or really effusive emotions. They're a little bit more measured in these letters of friendship. So you can see here that Jefferson says, write to me sometimes and permit me to answer your letters. God bless you, my dear madam, your affectionate friend, Thomas Jefferson. And then George Washington is including his wife in this friendship with the woman here. The joint good wishes of Mrs. Washington and myself for yourself and family conclude me, my dear madam, with great esteem and regard, your most obedient and most humble servant, George Washington. So that's a really lengthy closing, but not that unusual for this period. And by including Mrs. Washington here, he might not have mentioned her elsewhere in the letter, but he is bringing her into that relationship here through the closing to this letter. And you see he's, again, referring to her as madam instead of by her first name.
You see the other way around, too. When men write to men, they often include the wives in the...
Yes, and men did this, too. I think that these letters, part of why we see so much care with this is that people understood that these letters, A, could be intercepted. Somebody could... Especially if the letter was being delivered internationally, there was no international postal service. You had a private person taking it for you. Somebody could open it. And B, when you received a letter, the idea was you were going to share it with the people around you. You were going to pass it around. You were going to read it aloud. So people really did have to think about these issues when they wrote one another. They also had to be concerned about propriety when they gave gifts. And portraits could be exchanged with propriety between friends. We see this obviously with more wealthy people. A lot of the founding fathers would be included in this group, and portraits were hanging in a public space. So that was okay for propriety's sake to exchange between friends. But when it comes to miniatures, like this one here, unless it's somebody whose image is reproduced widely, like Benjamin Franklin, you don't see those miniatures being exchanged between friends of the opposite sex. When you got a miniature, this was something to look at it closely. You had to hold it up close to you. You might wear it on a necklace or in a pocket close to your heart. So it was a much more intimate relationship with a miniature than it would be with a portrait. And that may be why John Paul Jones, who was a naval hero from the American Revolution, misunderstood the gesture from a woman in France named the Comtesse de Lowendahl, who painted a portrait of him and sent it to him. Usually it would be sending a portrait of yourself to the other person as a gift. In this case, she was a bit of an artist, sent this to him. He took that as a romantic gesture and wrote her back saying, here is a cipher so we can write each other in code and basically start an affair. And she wrote back, no, I think the man I live with, in other words, my husband, would not approve of this, and I think you misunderstood me. He tried to cover his tracks and said, no, it's okay. Why are you worried about this? Because, quote, friendship has nothing to do with sex. Now, he was pretty clearly trying to have an affair with her as well as several other women in Paris at the time, so there's something a little disingenuous here. But there were people, as I mentioned, who could have miniatures as a gift to friends of the opposite sex. Here's a miniature painted by another French woman, actually, of George Washington. And he gave engravings of this to several female friends. And you see him here very much as, a Roman Cincinnatus figure. There's something a little bit impersonal about this. It's certainly Washington as the public figure. And we can contrast that with the miniature that he gave Martha Washington that is much more intimate. In fact, his hair is on the back of it in braided hair. And you can see there's a lot more detail. He's still in his military uniform, but obviously with a lot more color and life to it. So we can see the difference there. People could also give gifts of hair. And George Washington either had a lot of hair, grew his hair very quickly, or a lot of people in collections have hair that's not really his. But this particular locket is at Mount Vernon. This was a lock of hair that he gave to Elizabeth Walcott, whose husband, Oliver Walcott, had been in Washington's administration. She was friends with him and had requested a lock of hair from him. She actually got probably one long piece of hair that she cut into several pieces, and there are 3 different pieces she had made. And this is engraved on the back telling us what it is. And there's actually a story about when she got this hair. The story goes, Mrs. Washington, after hearing this request for the lock of hair, instantly took her scissors and with a happy smile cut a large lock from her husband's head, added it to one from her own, and presented them to her friend, to Elizabeth. And so hair, we might think of that as something kind of strange or possibly intimate to give to a friend. But there's a few things here. Obviously, this is free. Nobody's having to spend money to do this. It is also a resource that is somewhat inexhaustible here. You could give locks of hair to a lot of different friends without a problem. And there's the fact it does last forever. This does not decay. So it is sort of a substitute for the self that is going to last in just the way that a portrait would, but with some more propriety. Another gift that people exchanged in this period was poetry. And this is a poem from the collections here in the manuscript collections of the George Washington papers from Annis Boudinot Stockton, who I mentioned before. They met during the American Revolution, and she ended up starting to write poems about George Washington and sending them to him. So you see one example of those here from August 1783. I want to share another example here from a poem the next month that she wrote that ended with these lines. Some tuneful Homer shall in future days sing thy exploits in celebrated lays, while my ambition has no other name than as thy friend to set my humble name, Amelia. Now her name was Annis, but this was a pen name which a lot of poets in this period liked to do. She apologized for sending all these laudatory poems to him, and he wrote back, well, I'm going to punish you by making you come to dinner with me. And it's a very playful letter, which some people have misinterpreted as a flirtation, but this is part of the playfulness of a friendship and the back and forth of a friendship in this period. So I've been talking about a lot of friendships involving prominent people who were in politics. And that brings up the next question, which is, what did these friendships mean for the nation's political life? All of the founding presidents had female friends, as did many elite men at the time. And the fact is, many elite men at some point served in some kind of government capacity. And when a politician is involved, there's an exchange in both directions of political information, access, and influence. In this period, before there's a firm two-party system, personal interactions are really key to making politics happen. And this means that women who are friends with male politicians have an entry into the nation's political life. There are women actually in explicitly political spaces in this period. There would be women sitting on the floor of the Senate next to senators while speeches and debates were going on. So I'll share one quote with you from Mercy Otis Warren, who was a prominent Massachusetts woman writer, early historian, who was friends with John Adams. And she said in 1774, "I disregard the opinion that women make but indifferent politicians. When the observations are just and do honor to the heart and character, I think it very immaterial whether they flow from a female lip in the soft whispers of private friendship, or whether thundered in the Senate in the bolder language of the other sex." So we can see she might be picturing a woman sitting next to a senator on the floor whispering her opinion on something. She can't get up and say it out loud in front of everybody, but she does still have a role to play here. And Mercy Otis Warren certainly was not shy about sharing her political opinions. There's another example from the correspondence here at the Library of Congress between a man named David Bailey Worden and Eliza Parke Custis, who was George Washington's step-granddaughter. And David Bailey Worden had been appointed as a government representative, sort of lower level in France, and he was having trouble keeping government appointments, and Eliza was advocating for him with the Madisons. And she was also writing him with the latest information from Washington, so that he would get it basically before the newspapers did. And news of the political climate and the machinations in Washington, who was in power, that was very important to him. When he was removed from his position as consul in 1814, she reported, quote, "I never heard a word to your disadvantage from any of the government people." So she was interacting with these people, letting him know what was going on. She then discussed the general political climate, reporting that the government is now unpopular, and she would be pleased to see Madison leave office. She also gave him details on Congress's debates on the budget and news of how the manufacturing industry was doing during the War of 1812. So she's giving him really detailed information that is going to be useful to his political career. And this, can go both ways. We can have a woman requesting information from a man who is in power, has closer access, or as we see here, we have a man asking for information from a woman who is in a different place and can give him information he couldn't get otherwise. In a more abstract sense, I think that these friendships really represent the larger political values of this period. Equality, in the sense that men and women were on pretty equal ground in these relationships. Choice and freedom of who to be friends with and whether to leave a relationship. And finally, virtue, this idea that they're fostering virtue in one another through their relationships. So where does all of this leave us? I think from the historical point of view, we tend to think about the founding fathers or founding brothers. And really, we need to think about a community of men and women who set up the politics and the governance of the new nation. We need to understand the way that relationships really build politics in this period, and also understand that there's a lot more flexibility in gender roles and relationships than we might have imagined. And finally, in terms of where this leaves us for today, I think that this also pushes us to think about our own relationships differently, to think about how we express our emotions, what we mean by love. Do we have enough words to explain love between friends even now? And also the fact that as in the 19th century, there was this focus on funneling relationships between men and women into marriage that I think still persists today. And we are broadening our understandings of sexuality. We also need to broaden our understandings of what non-sexual relationships are possible and what emotional forms might be possible. So despite the fact that there were more risks and restrictions in the past, the founding generation, some of these men and women that you see here, made these friendships work. And that's a lesson for us about possibilities for relationships and even how we create the fabric of our society. Thank you. I have time to take a few questions. Yes?
Could I ask you whether this is a unique American phenomenon, these intimate and very intellectually stimulating, or whether this is, you see this in England and France and other undeveloped countries as well?
So the question was whether this is a uniquely American type of relationship or whether it occurs in England and France. And I actually spent a lot of time looking at England and France to understand what is uniquely American. These relationships are actually much easier among the very high elite in England and France, where frankly there's a lot less worry about sexual propriety, and it is expected that women are going to be seen with people that they're not married to, and that they are going to, in some cases, in the high elite, have affairs. There's comments, Abigail Adams pretty much observes that if you're seen with your husband too much in France, it's seen as inappropriate. So that really opens up the space for these relationships in a way that it is not open in America. And that means that these worries about propriety just aren't there. On the other hand, it does give political weight to these relationships in America in terms of how they represent these bigger values of the period. Mm-hmm.
I had a question about your quotation from John Paul Jones. When he says, when he says friendship of whatever or something isn't sex. I guess my question is, when he said sex, is that, I read that as a 20th century understanding of that word. And did he mean gender? He said friendship has nothing to do with sex. In other words, men and women can be friends, or did he mean they can't get like
Right. She's asking this comment from John Paul Jones, friendship has nothing to do with sex. And in the context of that, he is talking about sexual intimacy because he's responding to her concern that he's trying to open an affair with her. And the fact is, as I've just said about in France, this Comtesse de Lowendahl is saying, oh, my husband might mind. Maybe her husband did, but, the fact is a lot of French women of her class in this period did have multiple lovers sometimes. So, she really just was looking for a friendship with him to advance her husband's career in part. So she had a particular agenda and he had a particular agenda. Mm-hmm.
And you did not get to research a bit about these types of friendships with lower classes?
Yeah, so the question is, right, these relationships with lower class people. And I tried several different ways of getting at that. I thought that perhaps court records would have something, and didn't really find avenues there. I'm hoping that in the future somebody else can figure out how to do that. But the fact is that the sort of things I was talking about in terms of the role of women in this period and what these political values are, that is something that is really infused in the culture of the elite and upper sort of middling class people, and it's very different for lower class people. We know from some work by other historians that ideas about gender and politics and sexuality are very different for lower class people in America in this period, so that would have changed the entire contours of what those relationships would be like. Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you. This is really a fun and informative talk. I have to ask though, when you talked about the affection, these descriptions of affection between friends, is there any way to be able to then decipher? Because there seems to be sort of in some ways, sort of a murkiness to, is this just sort of playful, friendly affection, or is there something more to it? So when someone says something like he held my hand for 5 minutes, and you thought, oh, I've discovered an affair. Well, maybe not. There are a lot of ways, as you've shown, to express friendly affection. Why would someone choose something that over the top?
Yeah.
Or that hyperbolic?
Yeah, I mean, he's asking about how to really decipher this line, and I do talk about some sort of a continuum between friendship and romantic love that it's very hard to sort of pin down in a lot of these cases. In the case of the example of Margaret Bayard Smith and Thomas Jefferson, that is a fairly unusual example. Usually people did not express things physically in that way because they were worried about what people would think, and she had had experiences with people being worried about that before, even when she took a walk with the gentleman alone when she was engaged, that there was a woman saying, you shouldn't do that. And she's writing her husband, what is wrong with her? Why can't I do that? But I think in this case with Jefferson, he is in a very public space when he's doing this. And I think if he is doing that in front of so many people, holding a woman's hand, he must realize that people know what he means by it. He was also not married at the time, although we should say that even that from around the time that he became friends with Abigail Adams is when we think he started having a relationship with Sally Hemings, and it would have continued through this period in, when he's leaving office. But yeah, this holding hands, I think Jefferson can get away with it, Franklin can get away with this kind of thing because they're out in public. And it's that very publicness that actually makes it possible. Mm-hmm.
So what exactly is it that they're getting away with? I'm not sure. That's the piece I'm trying to understand. I mean, I think I appreciate your talking. It's great, but I think as any great historical work should do, I think you should read with more questions than answers. But I think I understand less what these relationships meant to these people now than I did or thought I might before. I'm not sure if I'm really asking a question or just prompting, but that's so. What was he getting away with by holding his hand for? What did it mean to him?
Well, so I think so. The question is sort of what are people actually getting away with, and what does it mean to them in terms of what they're getting away with? There is in this culture at this time, there are so many rules about how you're supposed to behave. There are etiquette books, there are letter writing books, there are books that tell you how to hold a pen when you write a letter to somebody. There are books and advice letters that are telling you how to hold your body. It's so regimented in so many ways in this culture in terms of what the expectations for your behavior are, that doing something outside of what is prescribed, I think, is sort of getting away with something. Even if a lot of people are doing it, every time you're doing that, it's sort of a little act of rebellion, but it's being couched as something safe. So you're not really trying to overthrow the whole system. I think in terms of what this meant, it meant being able to have a close relationship with somebody you cared about, whether that person was the same sex or the opposite sex. And I think we've imagined that people could have close relationships with family and spouses and friends of the same sex. But the idea that they could have a close relationship with the opposite sex is something different, and they could get different perspectives from somebody of the opposite sex, especially in the example of courtship. They're getting somebody, if you want as a man to know what is going on with the woman you're courting, you really can't ask her. You need a female friend that can help you with that. If you want political information from somebody that is not actually running for office and doesn't have the same level of an agenda, although they have some agenda, then you're getting that. So there are benefits that you get from just being in a relationship with the opposite sex, too. I hope that helps.
I have a follow-up, but I want to speak about it.
Was there another? Uh-huh.
You mentioned Angelica, Skyler Church earlier. I just wondered if you had a chance to examine her relationship with Alexander Hamilton, because there was a lot of talk that as brother and sister-in-law, they were maybe a little too close, but then it seemed like what he was saying kind of brought his wife in the conversation. Did you get a chance to look at that?
Yeah, so she's asking about the relationship between Angelica Skyler Church, who was Alexander Hamilton's sister-in-law, and Hamilton himself. And there's actually a great article by Jan Lewis on that relationship, as well as Jefferson's relationship with Angelica Skyler Church, although she has some different interpretations from mine. But the reason I didn't end up writing about that relationship in the book is that in this period, a sister-in-law was considered the same as a sort of blood relation. It would be incest if his wife had died and he had married her in some states. So that makes it a different kind of dynamic. But you're right that there were people who were worried that they were too close and might have had an affair. I think that Hamilton, given what we know about him, could very well have. There might have been something going on. We don't know. They certainly couched that relationship as a sibling friendship, but it's certainly possible that something else happened. Mm-hmm.
Can you share a little bit about what your research entailed to write this book?
Sure.
Library materials or other materials?
Yeah, so the question was about the research that went into the book. I went to about 25 different archives to do research for this. So a lot of the materials came from published documents. Because of papers projects for all the founding fathers, a lot of letters are published and even available online. And what I would do before I went to an archive is look at their website, and there are finding aids for a collection that will tell you about what's in it. And I'd just look for correspondence listed between a man and a woman with a different last name. And then sometimes it would turn out they were siblings-in-law or they were related, but a lot of times, and that's how I found, actually the finding aid for the John Rogers stuff here says that it's letters with his friend Ann Pinckney. And so I just went through finding aids for every collection. I would also keyword search for friend, although that didn't work in the Quaker archives. That was a little bit trickier. But I would go to an archive and just check those letters I had found from finding aids, which librarians and archivists put together, and then, as you can tell, are immensely helpful when we're doing research. And I also read a lot of novels, etiquette books, other sort of treatises from the time, and pieced all of that together. So it was a process that took many years. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in your mention of the friendships not necessarily excluding sexual intimacy. And I was wondering whether there was sort of a norm of, or whether there existed any structure where people were sort of polyamorous, where they had a spouse and then friends as well who they were sexually intimate with, but were not in the context of an affair.
Right. So the question is whether there was sort of a structure available for people to have multiple romantic relationships, and not in the U.S. Definitely not in the U.S. That would have been quite scandalous in the U.S. and could have ruined a woman's reputation. In France, it's a different story. And when Gouverneur Morris, for instance, who was America's representative in France for a little while in the early 1790s, is there, he writes in pretty explicit detail in his diaries, which are in the manuscript collection here, about his sexual intimacy with various women who he sometimes called his friends. And then his interactions with the sort of official lovers of those women, and then his interactions with the husbands of those women. So in France, there is a much greater span of possibility. And even there's the novel from this period that we know as Dangerous Liaisons, that people in America are like, do not read that book, it's not appropriate, we're not even going to read this. That does suggest that, too, that there's this bigger span for sexual intimacy. But right, in the US, it's really confined to courtship. It was, while not often officially okay, in the late 18th century, about a third of women in New England were pregnant at the point they got married. So, this is not just, but the idea was they better get married. So it is much stricter in the U.S. Might have time for one more question.
One more question. Two more questions we could take.
Yes?
Do any diaries exist that maybe give you any additional information, and even for sort of a more common person as opposed to someone famous?
Yeah, so the question is about diaries, and there are diaries from the period. I looked at a lot of them. Usually those are, middling to upper class people who keep diaries too, because paper and books were expensive, and just having the time to do that. And so there are some diaries, and some of them even have been transcribed and published. And Louisa Catherine Adams' diaries, for instance, to give a prominent example, her diaries were recently, or part of them were recently published, and she does talk about her friendships with men in those. There's another young woman whose diary was published by a small press under the title Passionate Spinster from the 1780s, and she writes about her different romantic relationships, which she thinks she's in a novel, basically, the way she writes about it. So we can get really good information from diaries.
One more question.
Anybody else who has a gun desk? Okay, go ahead.
But wait, it's your second question. No, go ahead.
I was wondering whether you thought that something fundamentally has changed in these relationships between then and now, or whether it's sort of just that we talk about relationships with different language, or we have different modes of interacting, but we still have similar sorts of relationships.
So the question was whether these relationships have changed fundamentally since the past. I think a surprising amount has not changed, and that's what surprised me the most working on this. There was an article by a sociologist from the 1980s that was looking at the challenges of friendships between men and women, and the challenges he outlined were pretty similar to what I saw in early America. There are still worries for people about making their relationship appear safe to those around them. But I think the big difference is what these relationships meant for people and the risks involved. So in terms of what they meant, they had a much bigger political meaning in the early republic, when the new political system is still being formed and when personal relationships are so integral to setting up the new government. And in terms of the risks, you don't have a woman losing her chance to be married because somebody thinks she might have had an affair with a male friend. I mean, there's some level of risk, but it is not at the level of ruining a woman forever that it was in early America.
All right. Well, join me in thanking Cassie for a wonderful talk. I'll just make a couple of observations. If you haven't seen the book or purchased it yet, once you do, you'll see she's done a remarkable job in the resource area of documenting, not only with notes, but with explanations of other resources that have been used. The book also is very well written and has gotten terrific reviews, and I have to point out 2 of them are from previous female speakers about early America who've given talks in our series. One is Catherine Algor, and who wrote about Dolly Madison in that whole period, which included a lot about friendships, and Joanne Freeman, who for years was at the Library of Congress, and some of you may know, who wrote actually about Alexander Hamilton largely. So these topics have come up, and we're pleased to continue to support this mini little specialization in our Books and Beyond series. And it does bring me to say that the next talk in this series is actually also about early America. It's April 14th, and it's David O. Stewart, whom many of you probably know in the Books and Beyond program. His new book is Madison's Gift, 5 Partnerships That Built America. So we go from friendships to partnerships in a 2-week period, and I invite you back for that. That will be actually on the 3rd floor in the Pickford Theater, if you can join us. And there is a schedule in the back of our forthcoming talks in this series. The book sales still go on, and the signing will take place at the sales table. And I must say one more time that our Cassie has done a great job. It may be a cliche, but hasn't she done a great job in bringing collections to life, both from the Library of Congress and from these other institutions? So let's give her a final round of applause and meet her at the table. Thank you so much. You did a great job.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.